And this is my fourth speech, and it's going to be on the death penalty and the mentally ill. And this is my audience. I'm just going to pan and show everyone. And of course, one behind the camera.
Yeah.
And my purpose today here is to persuade you for the need for legislative reformation regarding the mentally ill and the death penalty. In Ford versus Wainwright, Ford, a mentally ill defendant, asked his victims to be brought into the courtroom so they could be resurrected by God. This legislative reform could be in the form of an exemption to reduce the years of expensive and time-consuming litigation. I've done several hours of research on the death penalty, and I find it fascinating that the mentally ill are not afforded the same rights as a person designated with mental retardation. Before we begin with the problems, let me first discuss with you some of the characteristics of mental illness. We have impulsivity, we have deficits in cognitive processes, we have suggestibility, delusions, and extreme compliance. Now that we know some of the characteristics of the mentally ill, let's look at 8 distinct problems that we have in the current criminal justice system. And the first is within police interrogations. A mentally ill person can be easily swayed by police interrogators, and this can potentially result in false confessions or other admissions to the crime. Second is competency to stand trial. Does a mentally ill person have the ability to understand the current criminal justice system and the trial process? I don't think so, but let's go on. Third, the formation of criminal intent. In Clark versus Arizona, the U.S. Supreme Court stated defendants do not have the right to present any evidence to prove intent. How can a mentally ill person express what's the difference between right and wrong or express their intent? Fourth is a mitigation process. Defendants have the right to present any mitigating circumstances, and some of them will bring in child abuse as a mitigating circumstances. Some defendants will bring in involuntary hospitalizations. But with Panetti versus Quarterman, Panetti was not allowed to bring in any mitigating circumstances regarding his mental illness, and he was still sentenced to death, with the court citing him making a mockery of the court. Fifth are additional issues at capital trial. Some of these additional issues can be, well, the mentally ill can't understand what's going on at court. They often frighten the jury by outbursts or weird facial expressions, which can cause the jury to then turn around and vote for execution. Then if they're medicated, then they lack empathy and they look like they don't have any emotion whatsoever regarding what happened. Sixth are executions. In Ford versus Wainwright, the court left the determination of sanity up to each state. And in Atkins versus Virginia in 2002, the court prohibited executions of people designated mentally retarded. Now there is a difference between mental retardation and mental illness. In Panetti versus Quarterman, the court reaffirmed the defendant cannot be executed if found incompetent, and clarified the Ford standard. And then we have seventh, then the corrections. Did you know that in 2010, there were 3,261 death row inmates? And according to the U.S. statistics on mental illness, 5 to 10% of those have a mental illness. So we're looking at between 163 and 327 of those people on death row have a mental illness. Now, these people with the mental illness, the 300 up to 326 of them, will additionally cost the correctional facilities. It will cost the expense of extra personnel and the expense of medication. And this all goes back to the taxpayer. And the eighth, forced medication. In forced medication, Washington versus Harper, I'm going to kind of go chronologically here. Washington versus Harper in 1990. The state said forced administration of antipsychotic drugs was medically appropriate. And then in Riggins versus Nevada in 1982, Riggins was not convicted and involuntarily medicating, and the court disallowed Riggins to stop medication use to assist in his own defense, and he was subsequently executed. In Sell versus the U.S. in 2003, Sell was accused of a nonviolent crime and found incompetent to stand trial. Thank you. But the court ruled he be forcibly medicated, citing the U.S. Constitution allows the federal government to administer antipsychotic drugs, even against somebody's will in limited circumstances. That's a little bit scary for me. And then in Singleton versus Norris in 2003, the state of Arkansas was allowed to continually forcibly medicate prisoners that were on death row, citing the safety of not only Singleton, but the rest of the prison inmates. So what can be changed to avoid these problems? What can be done to, like I stated before, with reformation in the form of an exemption? Maybe some of the solutions are prisoners and the accused need to undergo psychological testing for competency, and they need to be evaluated for mental illness markers. They need to be done by independent sources to ensure the validity of these tests. And if found to be one or both, either incompetent or mentally ill, they need to be remanded to the nearest secure mental facility to ensure their needs can be securely met. Now, I realize that back in the 1980s and early 1990s, several of these mental illness facilities were closed down, and a lot of people were pushed out into the community, into group homes. But I believe that that was truly a good solution for some of the irons that we're now facing. Some of the drawbacks to this are overcrowded prison populations, stretched to limit court systems, and correctional personnel ill-equipped for mental illness. So the needs for my plan to work are money at the taxpayer's expense, private entity donations. Some of them, if they want to forcibly medicate them, let the drug companies pay for it. Capable mental facilities and personnel, and time. And in conclusion, for those who oppose capital punishment, Singleton represents many of the reasons capital punishment is inherently wrong. Believe it or not, I'm a strong proponent of capital punishment, but I do not believe somebody with a mental illness, somebody who cannot comprehend what's going to happen to them, needs to be put to death. I believe Justice Powell said it best in Ford versus Wainwright. The Eighth Amendment forbids the execution only if those who are unaware of the punishment they're about to suffer and why they're about to suffer it.